I'm generally not trying to think about co-ferments as like using apples as a filler, but I'm using them as a gateway to get people into cider.
Hello, my name is Ria Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world. Bringing us into this here episode 379 of Cider Chat was Matt Sanford. He is the head cider maker and winemaker at Rose Hill Farm, which is based in New York State. It's on the east side of the Hudson River. And I actually had an opportunity to visit Matt post New York Apple Camp, where that recording took place earlier this summer in the month of July. Upon arriving at Rose Hill Farm, I had a little sip of cider. I think it was maybe a co-ferment, because they do a lot of co-ferments at Rose Hill Farm. Primarily, I think, because they don't have the bounty of apples that they want just yet at the farm. And, you know, with these small orchards on the East Coast comparatively to the Pacific Northwest, where you have massive orchards, you have to work it. And that's where co-ferments really come in. So they have grapes and apples and plums and blueberries and cherries, quince, a lot of beautiful, beautiful fruit growing on the hillside. A lot of fun. I took a video. You'll be seeing that on all the different Cider Chat social media channels going up this week. So if you haven't yet subscribed to Cider Chat on YouTube, that's a good ticket to go there, or Cider Chat on Instagram at Cider Chat Ciderville, and also on Threads, where we have the Talking Palms going through a whole Apple Facts thing with Roxy, a.k.a. Roxybury Russet, taking the lead there, sharing Apple Facts. I think Roxy is talking right now about Cidra. Yes, Cidra in Asturias and the Basque region. So that's something to check out if you haven't been on Threads yet, because folks are fleeing X, formerly known as Twitter. Oh, it's just... Main Street has really changed these days, hasn't it? It's really changed from being downtown and talking to your neighbor now to this like internet, very cloud-based kind of communication we do, and yet we do it. And I think we're doing a pretty nice job just watching all the cideries and conversations going out there. So that's what we're going to be looking at this week. On this episode, you'll be hearing from Matt Sanford and also the other presenter at this talk. And the title of the talk was all about co-ferments. It was none other than Dan Pucci. And of course, everybody knows Dan because he co-authored a book titled American Cider, A Modern Look at a Historic Beverage. And that came out in 2021. The presentation itself took place on Saturday night of New York Apple Camp, and it was really informal, which was really the scene at this Apple Camp and what I've also experienced at Maine Apple Camp. It's kind of gives you a certain sense of intimacy and connectivity with everyone, which is really nice in this day and age. So lovely, lovely time. And this is going to be one of many Apple Camp recordings that I'll be rolling out. I might be throwing something into the pie before I start going with it. I'm not sure. You know, it's always an interesting experience here on Cider Chat, so stay tuned. But before we get there, as always, I have some news from out and about in Ciderville, starting with a word from our sponsors. So I really encourage you to listen through that, click on the links, check them out. It helps them, it helps cider, and certainly it helps this podcast.
Where the rugged beauty of southwest Idaho meets the Oregon border, a unique agricultural tapestry unfolds. This is the Treasure Valley, a gem nestled between Boise and the Snake River, a land of golden horizons, vibrant communities, and orchards that stretch as far as the eye can see.
While Idaho may first conjure images of potatoes, those in the know recognize it for another rich bounty. Here, in the embrace of warm days and cool nights, apple trees thrive, producing fruits that are a testament to nature's finest.
From the heart of this valley, You will find select ciders made by the artisanal cidery known as Cider Cider.
Every bottle is a symphony of flavors, encapsulating the very essence of the Treasure Valley. It's a harmonious blend of small batch, traditional ciders and innovation, crafted with care and precision. Each sip, a loving tribute to Idaho's apple-growing legacy.
In its range, you'll find both time-honored classics and intriguing new blends. But every variety carries with it the spirit of this special region.
As you enjoy the refreshing taste of Cider Sisters cider, know that you're savoring more than just a drink. You're partaking in a piece of the Treasure Valley, a region where nature and agriculture dance in perfect harmony.
When you find yourself in southwest Idaho, between the bustling life of Boise and the serene flow of the Snake River, pause. Let the magic of the Treasure Valley envelop you, and raise a glass of the finest Cider Sisters cider. Cider is going up in Idaho, and the Northwest Cider Association can help you find your next perfect glass. Go to nwcider.com and start planning your Idaho cider tour today.
Fermentus is a leader in providing fermenters cultivated yeast for your cider, and they have 4 different profiles. This week, we're talking about Saf Cider AS2, and that is one specific yeast, and the AS2 stands for apple sweet. You can use this yeast to bring sweetness and complexity to your cider. Saf Cider AS2 ensures a very good assimilation of fructose and is excellent for low-gravity ciders. The result is a fresh, aromatic profile of apple and citrus with nice, elaborate fruit notes of applesauce. Saf Cider AS2 will bring to sweet and dry ciders complex aromatic profiles between fresh and cooked fruits and a rounder mouthfeel. Want to explore diversity of cider profiles? Discover it through the selection of yeast strains by visiting their website, fermentus.com. Up next is a featured presentation pre-recorded at New York Apple Camp. The title of this here episode is The Intricacies of Cider Co-ferment. The actual presentation itself was just titled Co-ferments. But there's a lot of intricacies, a lot involved, and I felt like Matt really offered up a lot of info on how he's managing this. I first met Matt when he came up to me and handed me a quince, and I think there were some medlars too, if I recall correctly. He was in the area where I am in New England, and he had just visited Scott Farm in Vermont, which is just over the border, and he was listening to Cider Chat. He heard about the talking palms, my affection for medlars, quince, and pears, and, all of that. If you're a regular listener, you know that that's been a long-term topic that comes up throughout all the different seasons, and now we are in season 8. And I was just so touched by that. This guy is really unique amongst cider makers, and there's a few of you out there, too, if you're listening, who are kind of traveling about the world, helping different cideries manage. So he's been down in Chile, he's been overseas, and now he's rooted for now, and I hope for a while, because it's so nice to have him so close by, at Rose Hill Farm in New York State. Again, that's on the east side of the Hudson River. Just 40 minutes out of New York City. And then there's Dan Pucci, who's always a really great guy to see, filled with a lot of good info on cider. Pretty dynamic speaker in so many ways, because he's fun to listen to how Dan talks about cider and tasting it. And I know listeners out there in Ciderville, you enjoy that too, kind of seeing how folks who are AKA professional drinkers, and I consider myself in that league, talk about cider. For me, it's a very feeling piece, where it brings me the memories of flood. Taste is all connected to memories, and also creating new memories too. And so you'll hear both these guys going through it. Again, very informal. It's in a big cafeteria area, so there's people speaking up. In the background, you're going to be hearing a question from John Bunker. You'll hear something from like Elizabeth Ryan. These are all really amazing people in the apple and cider community. And what better way to spend a Saturday night than being in a room full of apple fans and really experts. I was sitting across from Todd Little-Sebold, who is a professor at the College of the Atlantic, and next to him was Lydia, who was one of his students, Pendergrass, and she is speaking now on different things in terms of apples, just right next to you, all over. And so you get to like delve into it, and what a fun time. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did recording it and tasting the ciders. You could get more info at the show notes to this here episode by going to ciderchat.com, episode 379, titled The Intricacies of a Cider Co-ferment. And you'll find links to Rose Hill Farm and to Dan Pucci and his book, American Cider, A Modern Guide to a Historic Beverage. And as I figure that many people out there in Ciderville may not know what Dan or Matt's voice sounds like, do know that the first speaker is Dan Pucci, and then you'll hear Matt chiming in. So Matt has a very low voice, and that's how you could discern the two. So without further ado, let's roll to this featured presentation, episode 379 of Cider Chat, titled The Intricacies of a Cider Co-ferment.
Did you hear us talk about co-ferments and how we drink them, how they're made, and for me, but understanding them in the context of other cider, of how they can be a very different thing comparatively to traditional apple cider. We have Blackduck Aronia. I forgot exactly how much Aronia is in this. 92% apples and 8% Aronia. But I think of co-ferments as being kind of separate, where you kind of get those great cider characters to it, but also adds extra layers of tannin and fruit and funk that you don't necessarily get from the apples themselves. I think Matt should talk for a second about how to make co-ferments, because you're actually the person who makes these things.
Well, I think we should talk about how we do fermentation first, right? So what do we need to do fermentation? Sugar. There we go. Thank you. That's kind of our basis for starting here, right?
That sounds good. We like sugar.
If it has sugar, you can ferment it. If it's made from fruit, then it becomes wine.
Yeah.
Cider is wine. We can all sit here and fight, or who's going to fight me on that one?
That's a fucking lie.
So, 90% apples and 8% Aronia.
8%, so that would make it 92% apples.
Yeah, that's what I said, right?
Oh, okay, you said 90.
Whatever. That was tough.
I can't speak to how John made this one, but I'm assuming.
Yeah, but in general, how we make these co-ferments? How are they different from flavored ciders?
So, well, if you're flavoring something, then you're probably not making cider, right? Arguable. Yeah. Anyways, so co-ferments were on train of thought.
Sugar. We have sugar.
So I think there's a couple of different ways that we can start off by doing co-ferments. Sometimes you have fruit that can be pressed just like an apple. Like a co-ferment could be something as simple as just mixing apples and pears, and we can call that a co-ferment. But then it can also be more complicated, where you have something like Aronia berries, where you're probably not going to have the ability to extract juice from Aronia berries. You're going to be likely putting whole Aronia berries on top of already extracted juice or finished cider. Personally, I consider most co-ferments as taking juice or apple juice or whatever you're co-fermenting in juice form and mixing it with something else that has not yet been fermented, versus taking a finished product and putting it back on top of that, but that could be arguable there. I think that's when you come into more flavoring versus co-fermenting something, taking a finished product and then adding a flavor back to it, like putting Aronia berries on a finished cider, versus taking fresh juice and putting Aronia berries on top of it. The fruit that you're adding to co-ferment with your cider or your wine or what have you should be bringing its own sugar element there and creating its own alcohol, versus if you're taking, say, lavender and putting that on top of a finished cider, that's when I fall into more of the flavoring category, but you're probably not re-fermenting anything there.
Lavender's not a lot of sugar.
Not a lot of sugar and herbs and those types of things.
So are you macerating the berries?
In this particular one, we're just working off of assumptions here, because it's made by Blackduck Cider. I'm from Rose Hill Farm. I'm assuming he's taking the Aronia berries, picking the whole Aronia berries, and putting that on top of apple juice. This isn't nearly as extreme in flavor to some Aronia ciders he's made in the past, which also leans that he probably did it in the primary fermentation versus taking the finished cider and adding it back, which then would probably extract a little bit more color and a little bit more like depth of flavor.
This is very like pleasantly like light berry flavors and things like that.
Yeah.
Is less tannic than sometimes Aronia can really. I think Aronia ciders can be very tannic.
Very tannic and very acidic, because they tend to bring a lot of acidity to it.
The berries are crushed, you think?
I think they're
We
probably
should have done some research before this.
We should have called John, but
Yeah,
we
yeah.
didn't do that stuff.
From a personal level, I like to ferment when I'm doing co-ferments. In this regard, using whole fruit versus crushing of the fruit, because you tend to get some oxidative notes if you're crushing fruit before you're adding it to something. But everybody has a different technique for doing it.
Is that true for your stone fruits as well?
Yeah, I think it'll be easier when we're drinking the cherry
one?
next. Yeah.
So with the Aronia, the way that you think they did it, are you calling it a flavoring or a co-ferment?
No, I'm calling this a
Co-ferment.
co-ferment because I believe that he's taking whole fresh Aronia berries and putting it right directly on top of apple juice and allowing it to co-ferment. But mixing it in the primary fermentation, that's probably also why this cider isn't purple or like bright pink in your glass.
Yeah, it's more like rosé.
Because a lot of that color will drop out if you're only doing that fruit addition in the primary.
It's very refreshing on a hot day today. It's really good. Let's drink some cherries next.
Yeah, let's drink some cherries. That's
So Aronia is great. They're kind of palate cleanser here. So I think the thing about here at co-ferments is like we're looking for this kind of complexity of flavor and how the other fruits can really be in addition to like juice that can be kind of boring. Like Matt, what varieties do you typically use in your co-ferments?
in the cherry here? Or?
In the cherry here.
So we're diving in here is what we call our Pomme Cerise cider at Rose Hill. It's about 20% sweet and sour cherries and 80% apples. When I'm doing co-ferments, I really like to think about it much more like cooking. You know, when you're cooking, you're not adding salt only at one time. You don't start the pot of soup and you add in all the salt at one time and you don't ever add salt again. That's kind of how I like to think about co-fermentations, and that you are layering your flavors. So what we're tasting here is a blend of both 2020 and 2021 Pomme Cerise. Each year we put about 20% cherries to apples, but we're layering it over time. So we're adding cherries both in the initial fermentation immediately after we press the juice. We're taking frozen cherries that we froze from over the summer. Predominantly sour cherries, but there's some sweet cherries that make it in there too. I like to use Danube and Balaton and all the pits in all the time, yeah. Very first year we ever made it, we extracted all the pits and realized that was a big waste of time. And every year after that we did.
The pits are really, I haven't had this cider yet.
Yeah, you tasted it like 6 months ago.
Okay.
Same with other stone fruits?
Yeah, all stone fruits, I leave the pits in all the time. The exception sometimes is apricots because they're really easy. A lot of times apricots, you can just sort of pinch them and the pits will just drop right out. Also apricots I find have an even stronger sort of marzipan flavor to them. So that's kind of, and we don't normally no one ever gets a very good apricot crop. So it's, working with what we have, and if it's only 100 pounds of apricots, that's not so bad. But probably what you're drinking there was nearly 2,000 pounds of sweet and sour cherries. So it's a lot of fruit to process. But in talking about layering of flavors, what we're doing is, so we're pressing our initial cider blend, which is a mix of heirlooms and bittersweets. Particularly, we're drinking there is a lot of golden russet and dabinette. Probably a little bit of Newtown in there as well. I should have looked up what was in there, but I'm pretty, if I recall. But we're taking the first round of cherries, putting that on the fresh pressed juice, allowing that to ferment to about 1,010 gravity or 2 to 3 bricks, somewhere in that range. And that's taking about a month or so, and that's extracting the first round of cherries. Then we're racking that off, and we're just very, very gently straining the cherries and the pits off of that. And then we're adding, once again, another massive round of cherries. 50% of what you're drinking was done in barrel, where we're actually filling each barrel with about 40 to 50 pounds of cherries, and then topping that up with the first round of cherry co-ferment. And then the other 50% was done in IBC over time. So the 2020 was in oak, and the 2021 was in was in Flex Tank. And then in 2022, so it's 3 years of cherry harvest that we harvested over, and in 2022 we picked the last about 500 pounds of sweet cherries, and we pressed those as sweet cherry juice and then blended that in to do the bottle conditioning. So adding those cherries at multiple different times. The 2020 saw 4 additions of cherries in total, and the 2021 saw 3 additions in total. But I think it's important to layer those flavors of the fermentation and not just pitching it all at once. I think the first Aronia is a good example of, adding a fruit in your primary fermentation, but then not doing any sort of follow-up to it, so it's subtle, versus the intent with the cherry there is to be very intensely cherry, and so it comes around on the
especially with strong, as you use Golden Russet and Dabinet.
Golden Russet, Dabinet, and probably
Newtowns, whatever, but still fairly strong flavored apples comparatively to other things.
Yes.
So we still has a cherry flavor really.
Initially, our first couple of years we did it with more high acid stuff, more just Northern Spy and Golden Russet, but then I started adding in the Dabinet, and it seemed to really bring things a little bit more rounder and fuller into the cider.
Really nice
also,
to it.
as everyone's orchards in New York come online, there's a lot more bittersweet fruit out there to be had. I can justify adding it to co-ferments. But not all every I think something that's to think about too is when you're doing your co-ferments is think about how much depth of flavor you want to have in your apples. Using really high acid apples are going to be really great to influence your flavor, and you're going to focus more on the flavor that you're trying to influence versus using more tannic apples. You can kind of mask some of those flavors of the fruits you're working with. So I think it's just about being selective with that. We do some co-fermentation with plums and those types of things, and with that, plums are such a strong, overpowering flavor in fermentation. We end up blending. Normally do a blend of chestnut crab and Gravenstein early season apples to blend with the plums, but doesn't make a really strongly flavored cider, because adding really strong bittersweet apples to something like plums, I think you end up losing something there, because it's all about the plum and that flavor is going to be dominant. So work with something that's higher acid versus higher tannin.
Yeah, I really like the balance here of the nice tannin from the bittersweets here. Really complement kind of that kind of savory marzipan sweet flavors as well. Do you need some cider?
Is there a bottle? Yeah.
What do you guys think?
Have you done any co-ferments?
Every year when we have peaches, if you guys listen, that's good. If we listened to Kevin's talk this morning, we don't have any peaches this year at Rose Hill. I have fermented some peaches alone to make peach wine, but generally I find all the peaches that we're harvesting are normally from the ground, and we have found that most of those peaches are, while very fermentable, make much better eau de vie than they do making co-ferments. Peaches are super high acid, and so something like peaches, really high acid, and you get that really strong, once again, marzipan flavor from the pits. Also, depending on the pits, I think the pits and peaches too can be really great harbingers of mouse. And so it's very often when we've done peach ferments that they get mousy and off.
What's in the? You do make a stone fruit, the Pearly Dewdrops.
Yeah, we do Pearly Dewdrops, and Pearly Dewdrops. I didn't bring it today, but Pearly Dewdrops is our predominantly stone fruit co-ferment. That's generally around somewhere in this 60 to 80% stone fruit fermentation of plums and cherries and apricots, and then the cider just gets blended in for one to thin it out and to do the bottle conditioning. But we're doing all of our fermentation, at least at Rose Hill, totally naturally. So we're not pitching any yeast in any capacity whatsoever. So when it comes to doing those stone fruit fermentations, I like to keep them all whole fruit and do it carbonically, especially when it comes to plums. Think about plums like you might think about Gamay, and that second plum flesh hits the air, it wants to oxidize. And same goes with cherries too. Cherries can also oxidize pretty quickly. You don't realize it because the pigments are so strong in it, but they can become oxidized and they can get cardboardy and woody, and those are good ways to make your cider mousy or your wine mousy, because it's not cider if we're adding cherries to it. We're making apple cherry wine. That's how this will be labeled too. It won't be labeled as cider. But anyways, with the cherries, we're keeping everything whole, and we're trying to keep as little oxygen off of it all the time. So yeah.
What are you guys' thoughts on the cider? It's so cool. I love the layers of the different kinds of cherries, like the fresh cherry and the marzipan and the roasted kind of.
Yeah, it's reading very sweet cherry to me right now, actually.
Are we tasting a little bit of the barrel effect?
Yeah. Well, like I said, about 50% of it was fermented and aged in barrel for about a year and a half.
What size barrel? That's standard.
The barrels, it was one Pucci and 3 Bordeaux sized barrels. So overall, it's about 1,100 liters in barrel, and then the other 1,100 it was in IBC. So in all, the batch was about 2,300. Then add in about another 150 liters of sweet cherry juice to the bottle conditioning. Also, another thing to think about, especially if you're working with stone fruit. Stone fruits have, and someone here probably knows the science better than I do, but have a lot of sorbitol and unfermentable sugars. So when you're checking your gravities, normally you want to work on the safe side. 1,004 is a safe number to put it into a bottle. If you're working with cherries and plums, 1,008 is a lot safer, or is a safe enough number to work with, because you're somehow able to read the sugar with doing a specific gravity measurement. But I generally find that if you bottle something that is highly plum or stone fruit based and it's reading 1,004, it's really probably 1,002.
How much sugar is in this thing approximately?
Like residual, or?
Yeah.
I think residual are probably at 0 here on this, but there is probably some amount of unfermentable sugars in here, of sorbitol and xylitol and all those types of things that exist within cherries and apples. I think particularly to a lot of the apples that went in here had a lot of water core in them, so we're dealing with a lot of sorbitol in that regard.
Are you using a blend of the 2 cherries? Is that like circumstantial because you have it, or are you trying to control fruit?
At Rose Hill, our ultimate goal is to utilize what we have. I try to always focus on using the sour cherries because I think that they have a better depth of flavor. They also have a lot more acid versus the sweet cherries are kind of lacking in that acid. But some years are better than others, So last year when we did the last round of cherry harvesting, had very little sour cherries for us to harvest. That's why I got bottle conditioned with sweet cherry juice, because that's what we had. But much of the fermentation in the primary was with sour cherries. It's just the bottle conditioning we did with mostly sweet cherries, and that was just exactly circumstantial. But we're growing 23 different varieties of sweet cherries and 3 varieties of sour cherries. So there's a little bit of all of them in there. So I would say there's probably about 25, 26 different varieties of cherries in there, what you're drinking in total.
So we have 2 fruits first. We have a berry and
2 grapes.
2 grapes. This is Cabernet Franc, I think, right?
I think mostly, yeah.
So we have from right over here in Esopus. This is Metalhouse's new cider, which is co-ferment of Cabernet Franc.
Pass it around.
So guys, next up is co-ferment of Cabernet Franc.
And Cabernet Franc skins
Cabernet
from
Franc
rosé.
skins, pretty dark, you call rosé. I forget the apple varieties that go into this. First on those guys, the cider is very Cabernet Franc-y. It's pyrazine, bell pepper, like kind of to the max. It's I think stuff from their orchard, which is in Esopus, and from the vineyard. The grapes are from Fjords, which is over in like Highland-ish, right? Marlborough. So for me, this cider almost reads more like this drinks and feels like it smells like wine, and it kind of drinks like wine almost. But like it doesn't have quite the body. What?
I want this to have bubbles.
They make it with bubbles too. We have a still wine we're pouring too, so we decided to pour the still version. But they have the same thing. They release with bubbles. This is the first year making it.
So I think they took Cab Franc skins and then dumped apple juice on top of it. I think it's mostly Max and Macoun's.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Max Macoun's over Cab Franc skins.
And then they let those Cab Franc skins sit on top of the cider for a few days, a few weeks.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So you get this kind of like Cab Franc heavy forward with a kind of slight apple cider texture. Cab Franc, it's basically drinking like Cab Franc light. It drinks kind of like piquette-y vibes type things more so than being like a cider. And I agree with Eliza. I want bubbles here. Like I want more pep and life in bubbles because it has like strong Cab Franc qualities to it. But like I want more like a lift for me. Yeah, I want more like lift and oomph.
Yeah.
But it's very refreshing. It's very nice and light. Color is great. I think these kind of things are really interesting to taste because we can kind of like these are really good as for consumer wise. Like these are really nice cider because it's a good like easy point from wine to cider because it's very.
Will they do a method champenoise on that?
I think they bottled as something.
I think they just did bottle condition this time around.
Yeah, they have that. It's the same price.
Oh no, they did disgorge it.
Is it disgorged?
I think so.
I'm not sure. They do have a sparkling version of it out there in the world as well.
Yeah,
we wanted to pour the still, but
they did it in 2 ways. I would say the Cab Franc in this context is being used more for color and to give it a light flavor, but it's still still drinking like cider to me, and that it's a little bit lighter in body.
It feels like cider on the palate, but it smells in the front palate, and the smell is wine. But once you drink it and you drink it for a little longer, it's like, oh, this is definitely cider.
Yeah.
Like if I was poured this, not knowing what it was, I would think it was wine and be like, what's wine? What's wine? It's like a weird. It's like.
Yeah, it almost leans to the piquette side of things.
Yeah.
To a little bit.
It kind of lines into that like light, fruity, fresh.
This is definitely something I think that needs a little bit of context to understand what you're drinking, for sure.
Yeah, because it does. Or else you'd be like, this is I got some very watery wine here. Then that's all the Macoun's too. So I think it's an interesting context between like the cherry.
What they have done to improve this? Or?
I think bubbles would have been would have been very helpful because they would have added a lot more texture to it.
And they did 2 different bottlings of this. One is a still and one as bubbles. I think it's kind of intentional in that it is kind of lighter in body and that it's supposed to drink more like a wine, but something that's not going to be quite so heavy.
Yeah.
But the bubble version,
Yeah, I think bubbles are nice because they add more that texture and mouthfeel to it, and they kind of mask those sensations of body and weight and alcohol. Their orchards are on the old Pell Estate property. They have like some guy owns. They have leased that land there. It's like they have some bunch of trees about 100 years old on that property. They're all what you would expect 100-year-old trees to be, and then. They have a newer orchard about, I think, 3 or 4 acres.
I think another layer of context to add to the cider, too, is that you're taking something like Max and Macoun's that arguably might not make the most exciting cider all the time, and then you're trying to utilize what you're growing, right? So it's not always about making the most earth-shattering cider or wine. It's about what do I have? What do I have the ability to work with? It's like I have Max and I have Macoun's. They're a great base to do something and create cider. And then you have something like grape skins from your local winery where they're making rosé, and they have these grape skins now this bit of depth of color and flavor to them. And so it's taking something that might be considered boring and then adding another element of flavor to it and making something that's kind of tasty and light and easy to drink. And so I think that's a good way, if you're farming apples and a lot of us have abundance of those varieties of apples, and we're often left kind of like, well, what do we do with these? You can turn them into brandy, you can try and make them into cider. And
retains value for the winery too, to have
exactly.
a sort, like, because grapes are really expensive in the Hudson Valley. And it allows you to retain value for those grapes by putting into a different product that can then hopefully be sold for a higher price point.
Right. You're utilizing apples that might have a lower value, and you're using something that would have gone, grape skins that would have gone to the compost and trying to make it a little bit more full circle. If you look at it through that lens, I think that, it makes it a lot more interesting and a much better value add product for your farm. As a way to make money.
It's really cool.
About a third of what we do is wine at Rose Hill, so we end up utilizing all those grape skins in some capacity. We'll dive into the next.
This is
next one
Matt's. Here. What do you guys think of the cider first before we talk about it? This is Matt's cider, so don't be mean about it. Tastes like really good Sprites. Like the best Sprite ever, like fresh mountain Sprites.
So.
Carries a lot of Riesling.
Right. Yeah. So what we're drinking is about 50% Riesling, 50% apples, right? On the apple side, our overall blend here is 25% Roxybury Russet, 25% Ashmead's kernel, and then 50% Riesling. We ran the Riesling through a destemmer, and then took those destemmed Riesling grapes and put it on top of the apple juice that was pressed the exact same day. Closed that up in an IBC and left it sitting for 2 weeks without punching it down or touching it at all, and just let those grapes, sit and float and soak up the cider and release their own juice into the apple juice. And so it's this is a true co-ferment, and it's very 50-50. And then after it's been about 6 months or so in stainless, and then another year in neutral French oak, and a little bit in glass as well. And then we bottled this up in February.
What do you call this?
This is called Chiffonner. This will be labeled as a wine. What we're drinking is 9.1% alcohol, so it's going to leans a lot more into the higher alcohol, fuller body. This is not trying to utilize, spent grape skins to reflavor cider. This is, pairing Roxybury Russet and Ashmead's kernel, some mildly likewise apples to each other. It was kind of just what was there. They were apples. These were grown at Indian Ladder Farms, but higher alcohol apples. I know the cider side of it came in at 1,077 gravity-wise, and the Riesling was about 1,081.
This would win over people who don't drink Riesling because it's sweet.
Totally. I think this is the context for this is to pour it for somebody who walks into the bar and says, "I don't drink cider."
Right.
But do you have a Chardonnay? Do you have a Riesling? Do you have a white wine you can pour me? You can. I think this is something. The context of this is to be able to pour this for a customer that says, "I don't like cider," and then you go pour them for this, and they go, "Oh, that's great. I really enjoy that." And then you go, "Well, you just drank 50% of cider, right?"
Fool you! This is half apples.
Yeah. So, but we're pairing Riesling and Ashmeads and Roxbury specifically because I think you can taste a Roxbury or an Ashmead's single varietal and pick out some very wine-like qualities from them. They're grapes that are not good, or they're apples that are not going to be very high tannin. They're going to be high sugar and high acid, and I think that's kind of the same way you could describe Riesling in some ways too. It's the only grape we've ever destemmed was for this wine. No, well we pressed the Riesling after 2 weeks of sitting. Okay. So we destem the Riesling, take that, put that on top of it. Yeah, lightly. In a bladder press? Yeah, in a bladder press. Yeah, in a hydro. No, in a hydro press. We didn't do any punch downs on this. We just allowed the Riesling itself to sit right on top of the apple juice and commingle and co-ferment and all those types of things. When we make wine at Rose Hill, we don't normally destem anything, but in this particular context, we took the stems away just because I didn't want to have a lot of stem influence onto the cider. I think in the last one we tasted, it probably was whole cluster, there probably was some stems in there.
Rosé.
Right, probably was direct pressed rosé, so there was stems in there. So that leans to be a little bit of a more herbaceous profile.
And pyrazine had in the last cider.
Right.
All kind of bell pepper, all kind of like pyrazine, bell pepper, like herby green notes.
Something that kind of differentiates this though, I would say from a lot of orange wines. A lot of orange wines, you're going to be having a bit of oxygen influence while you're, macerating your white wine grapes and you're allowing oxygen in there. We did this in a closed tank so that we kept all the oxygen out to keep the fermentation very clean as well.
Yeah. It's very it's a lot of the body is so unique though. The cider's its texture is kind of mind bending because it kind of has this I think of Riesling as being very direct and linear and either to a razor edge to a kind of fat. This is definitely more fat Riesling vibes, but that cider texture to it too is so it's just very interesting on my palate how it sits. If I was drinking this blind, I would think it was wine, but a lot of time I would have a hard time figuring out where to place it because of this kind of bizarre texture and its weight and its bitterness to it. It's unique. It's really interesting.
And our intent with this at Rose Hill is this is something we'll serve by the glass in the bar, and while we make wine and we make cider, we always trying to influence people to drink more cider. And I think that using co-ferments in this regard is a good way, is your gateway to get people to try cider.
Have you experimented with different apples with that Riesling? Because I was thinking this is really interesting because it takes that high acid, high sugar.
Yeah.
That has a lot of complexity put to it, but maybe not a lot of the roundness that some other of your apples.
Sure. I didn't in particular. I haven't played around with it much. This is something that I made.
Just tried it. Yeah.
As we all know, weather is very strange here in New York and everywhere else these days. So our harvests are very strange, and every year I try to buy Riesling, and I don't get Riesling every year.
This is Finger Lakes?
Yeah, this is Finger Lakes Riesling. Yeah, from Cayuga Lake.
What do you think of oak? You said this barrel.
Yeah. This has been some time in the oak barrel. When you're using oak in any regard, you're looking for a little bit of micro-oxygenation. With this too, I kind of wanted to further blend that cider and wine, and didn't want it to feel like you're just dumping one. I didn't want it to make it feel like they just were dumped together. So aging them in a vessel where they're going to micro-oxygenate together. We did a couple of top-ups in the barrel, we just did one singular top-up, and then afterwards we put a hard bung on the barrel, and it lived with about 5 to 6 inches of headspace in the barrels under floor yeast, and allowed that floor yeast to build more complexity into it and spend some time. So all of these had really dense floor yeast on top of them when we pulled it out. Especially some white wines can benefit from some micro-oxygenation, and I think that this is that context where you have something that's very high acid, bringing in a little bit of those oak tannins. Where I'm lacking the varietal, maybe something that's more bittersweet, you can kind of bring in more oak tannins and add a more roundness to the wine. So that's why we're going with oak, but haven't necessarily played around with more tannic apples.
When are you actually able to label it as cider versus wine?
Oh, that's a good TTB question. This will be labeled as wine. I personally, and probably to my own detriment, label anything that is not only apples as wine. So even the last one we drank, where it's about 20% cherries, we label that as apple cherry wine, and we just label it in order of appearance as far as the wines go. So like the Pomme Cerise, that'll be apple cherry wine. This will be labeled as probably apple grape wine or grape apple wine, because it is a pretty even 50-50 split. I generally don't try to talk about anything outside of in a learning context that's not only apples as cider, or I talk about something as a cider base but co-fermented with something. But if you add anything else to cider beyond apples, it becomes a wine in my mind. I generally talk about most things that are under 7% alcohol in the more of the cider range, though, even if I am labeling them as wine, just for context. But something like this, where it's 9.1, both TTB and New York State SLA are going to see it as wine. So I think the unfortunate side of this is I don't believe I'll be able to call out the varietal on here. I'll just have to call it apple grape co-ferment, but I don't think I'll be allowed to I won't be allowed to put Riesling on the label. Much more into giving something a nice name and utilizing our we're fortunate enough at Rose Hill to have a bar where we're able to serve our own products and have very well-educated bartenders that can really just spend the time with the customer, talking to them about what they're drinking and what their experience that they're having, and explain what's going into their glass.
TTB can't regulate your menu.
Right. Yeah. So just because I can't put a Riesling on the bottle, right? I can put a Riesling on the menu. So it works out in that regard. And my tag that hangs on the shelf and hangs on the bottle, it can say Riesling all over it. So.
Yeah, I really think co-ferments are at a moment a couple years ago when they really came out on the market. And I think they're really fun, interesting ways for new consumers to get into cider. It's a new approach, I think, to cider than there maybe wasn't a couple years ago. In California, it's been a really big thing. The co-ferments have got really crazy because they all the bad grape harvests in the last few years. People made a lot of rosé that people had a lot of red wine that should have been red wine but was now rosé because of smoke taint.
Yep.
And a lot of those smoke tainted grape skins got into cider and things like that.
I think people also I was just gonna say, as natural wine kind of takes over the wine world as well. You have a lot where 10 years ago you didn't have a ton of natural winemakers in California. Now you have a lot more, and those people are starting to see terroir beyond just grapes growing. They see terroir as, there's apple trees growing along the edge of our vineyards, or quince, or
if you have
elderberries,
and if your harvest has been so terrible as it's been the last few years because of smoke or whatever, that you have extra tank space to rather than keeping this tank I spent all this money on empty, I can put something else in there instead, and hopefully make some money off of this thing.
Yeah, I think people are learning that you can charge this as much for cider as you can as wine, especially if you're co-fermenting and putting those things together, but still talking about them as wine.
Yeah.
That's you can make a little bit more money off of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, adding value to those, like, you're in California with those fairly generic apples, or those Gravensteins and Newtowns and that. Generic.
And ultimately too, a lot of co-ferments are going to require more process and more time, and have more time in the cellar. So you should be, translating that into the price on the bottle too. So. Yeah,
and I think they're also good points too, because like the thing people can recognize, like people understand people see that cherry cider, and they say like, oh, like it's cherry, it's red. You can drink it. It has recognizable cherry flavorings to it.
Yeah.
It's a very deep and complex cherry flavoring to it, but it's much more obvious and like intro point for people to like recognize the product and then to make an assumption about it, rather than like people don't know what people may not know what Dabinet is or anything like that. So it's easier to like point them to these things that are recognizable. And like 10 years ago, that was blueberry cider that tastes like blueberries. Now we can move on to a point where we have like fermentation and flavors and adding complexity to it because of that.
Yeah.
Which is exciting.
I think another angle with that too is also taking something like blueberries that can be, well, I guess unless you live in Maine where blueberries are cheap, but adding more extension to that too, like something that's uniquely only blueberry per se. Take something that's 20% blueberry and then add 80% cider to it, and you can still get all the same nuance from the blueberries, but you have 4x, 5x the volume then.
We can think about using like premium varieties for this kind of stuff to make a really excellent product. We know what that is, but like no one else cares. So this might be an easier way for us to like get people into these really great products that are
I'm generally not trying to think about co-ferments as like using apples as a filler, but I'm using them as a gateway to get people into cider.
I'm gonna guess like the Aronia here probably also does have is probably mostly eating varieties of some or sharps. There's no bittersweets or tannin in here.
Yeah, well, I think you have a lot of tannin in Aronia berries themselves, and so that's something too to think about when you're doing co-ferments. A lot of the things that you're going to be co-fermenting are going to have a ton of tannin, so that's once again adding more depth back to what could be kind of boring or insipid cider, adding something that's very tannic to it, and utilizing that whole fruit once again, like Aronia berries, super high tannins. So using something that's high acid pairs really well with that. I think if you use the really high tannin apple with Aronia berries, you're gonna lose a little bit of something there because it's going to be all tannins. You're going to lose a little bit of freshness to it versus using something that's a little bit more higher acid. So. Currants, yeah, totally. Blacks, because there's a lot more. Titania is the one that I see most people utilizing. I've only ever used black currant skins. I say that I'm a black currant expert. I've only made black currant piquette before, utilizing black currant skins and apple water left over from ice cider making to do a type of black currant piquette.
Why do you have black currant skins?
From currant cassis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. From a natural perspective, because that's how I'm doing everything, gravity and temperature are your two best friends. When we're talking about cherries, you have an IBC, you have 200 pounds of cherries in there. It sucks to get them all out.
Do you have a flipper?
No, but you just go down and you open the valve up on the bottom, you get it all out, then by the time it drains out, then you opens it up. Cherries, I've never really bothered to press cherries post-fermentation, except when making straight cherry wine, then we press it. But when you're doing cherries in cider, I find it over about that. It need about 30 to 40 days for them to break down and they release all of their juices. And by the time you end up going and running it out, I haven't seen. It hasn't been worth my time to like flip the tank on its side and shovel the cherries out and load them back into the press. Because also, I find that sometimes when you're doing co-fermentations, the whole fruit that's been floating on top, it can be there can be a lot of bacteria tied up in there. And so I find that if you are taking that fruit post co-fermentation and repressing it, a lot of times I'm taking that pressing and keeping it separate from the main part that we racked off and waiting until it settles out and then tasting it. And if it tastes fine, it goes in. When we do all of our plum co-fermentations, like we ferment all of our plums entirely whole. Plums go 30 days, cherries go 55 days in carbonic fermentation. And we find cherries you have to press because they don't break down as much when you're fermenting them whole. But plums will extract about 70% of their juice before you even press them. But it's the only thing I'm very tight on the pressing. So when we ferment plums in 50-gallon drums or 400-liter flat-bottom stainless tanks. Yeah, short ones. And we pick them up and we just gravity drain them off or siphon them off with the hose. Yeah, right. And you can take about 2,000 pounds of plums and do that in a single 180-liter press because they've extracted all of their own wine and juice. But then what we're actually pressing in the press, I'm separating that from the main batch of plum jerkum per se. We're separating that out, and then we're only blending it back in, post co-ferments. I generally don't bother with the pump. It depends on if you have an impeller pump, things like blueberries, you can kind of get away with it. I generally buy you can use old stockings or just buy, brewers have figured this out a long time before cider makers did on, how to get grain out of it all. I don't use I don't own a filter, but I do have a inline strainer that's essentially just a fine mesh strainer that sits on the pump and that more so we utilize to keep rice hulls out of the juice. The grapes I find are a little bit easier too because we rack it off, and then we just treat the grape. We do repress the grape skins, but then once again too, we're tasting a lot as we're going along because even after you've re-fermented grape skins, you can still manage to over-extract. Sometimes that's fine. You can just over-extract grape skins, because you're just blending it down with cider later. Depends on what your goal is, and with grape skin co-ferments, I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. I make two different products. One where we take grape skins and we blend that with ground apples and allow those to actually sit, like the apple pumice to sit with grape skins and mash and co-ferment together. And then that's for our more premium product. A lot of time we're using early season apple like Holstein Cox and Gravenstein. Those more higher acid apples, but allowing them to sit with the grape skins to extract the tannins. And have them sit for about 5 to 10 days or so. It kind of depends on temperature and the time of year. But I think that you get a more nuanced flavor of the grapes coming out, but you also kind of like dye the apple pumice with the grapes as you're coming along. And that tends to be much more to the wine flavoring side of it all, versus then, this past year we make one called our Pomquette Rouge, which normally I would utilize leftover apple water from ice cider making, but haven't had the ability to make much ice cider the last few years because we've had weird winters, right? And also my local cold storage facility doesn't accept totes of apple juice anymore. So in turn, we have 10 bins of Honeycrisp coming in. Totally useless apple as far as cider making goes, beyond ice cider making. But we take that Honeycrisp and we dump that back on top of Cab Franc or Merlot or Noiret or Marquette or whatever grapes we have coming in, and we just rehydrate those grape skins and re-ferment it, and then press that all off all over again. Yeah, and then with that, I'm not less worried about over-extracting. I don't really mind if we extract a ton of it, because then even later on we're going in and blending in more bulk apple juice into it.
Like swing outdoors, we can rake out, or
when we're doing with the grape skins, we use half-ton macro totes. Yeah. So we're doing open fermentation with the grape skins with the apple juice. Yeah, exactly. But in that fermentation, that's when we do punch downs with grape skins with the apple juice to keep pushing it down and keeping trying to keep the cap submerged and treating it just like you're making a red wine. And then we end up blending in a lot of kind of bulk. John and Mac, Gala, whatever apple juice is coming in later in the season, or whatever's left at the end of the year, or this year when we bottled it, like all the piquette or the pomquette as we call it that we made was super super intense, because we didn't use the apple water, we used apple juice, so there's a lot more acid and or sugar and alcohol in it. So went and got 6 bins of sort outs from the farm down the road and pressed those off, and we just blended all that into the bigger depth. And yeah, it's not exactly my most premium product, but it's
pretty good.
But it lands at $14 on the shelf versus the other intentional grape co-ferment lands somewhere in the $28 to $40 price range on the shelf. So you're
working at all with French hybrids?
When they're available, but honestly, I don't get that many great hybrids these days, and I have a lot of good relationships on Long Island, so doing a lot more vinifera. But hybrids are great. It's just about finding people who actually have them that want to sell them and have the good ones. Yeah.
When you're working with plums, are they European or are they?
Yes, both. So things that I'm making that are focused on plum ferments, I'm using Japanese plums. Or Japanese hybrids, some of them, yeah. Shiro, Oblinaya, Early Golden, those are the 3 that we have most prolifically at Rose Hill, and that I think make really good stuff. But then we also grow Stanley's, Presidente, and Long Johns. I find Stanley, Presidente, and Long Johns lean to much more lower acid, higher sugar, and they make something that's much more, has a very strong like potpourri sort of flavor wine to it. And I've made some of that stuff and aged it out, and some of it I've ended up just distilling later because the distillate that comes from it is very nice. I'm trying to figure out how to make a vermouth using more of those Italian prune plums because I think they lean more into that fortified wine sort of flavor profile versus the Japanese plums are fruity and acid and very big flavors, and so I think those are better as drinking, kind of like drinking a sour beer in that sort of regard. So everybody can stop by Rose Hill on their way home tomorrow.
No, thanks, guys. Hi, Matt.
Go to ciderchat.com, episode 379, titled The Intricacies of Cider Co-ferments, to see photos of this presentation with Matt and Dan at New York Apple Camp 2023. And for those who have been fermenting for a while, or even currently, you may have heard a term called second wine, which is really what a co-ferment was called back in the day for those of us who are fermenting both grapes and apples. I recall many times where we'd get a whole bunch of grapes, one particular grape, Barbera, which I love making a jelly out of, and a wine, a great table wine. And we'd put it through a destemmer, pull out all the stems, it'd crush the little grapes a bit, go into the press it out. You'd get that pumice, those skins. Maybe you press it out a few days later. You sit there, letting it in primary a bit, then press it out, or you could let it draw out that first run, and that leftover grape skin, that bag of grape skins, you can make a second wine out of. And some folks would just add water, but of course, being in New England, we had a bounty of cider, fresh pressed apple juice, right? Sweet cider. So we'd add that, which allowed us not to have to add so much sugar to it, and would make a second wine. And I actually still have some bottles that are probably 20 plus years old from that time, and mainly because a family member found a case of my bottles, because they sometimes kick around. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. If you were living in a place that was too warm, you'd find a friend, a family friend, somebody like that who had a cool basement, and that's what happened. I got a case of some of those bottles about a year or so ago, and they're still good. They're still good. My goodness. Second wines. Not a lot of body, kind of super smooth, really great drinkable, and just fun because you're able to stretch your bounty, right? Stretch the fruit into other directions. And that's what they're doing at all these different cideries are really having fun. They're not only stretching it, they're making like super fine drinks. So check out, there's going to be a video coming up this week with my photos from both New York Apple Camp, this tasting, and my tooling about with Matt Sanford at Rose Hill Farm, taking the four-wheel Gator, which is like a four-wheel golf cart, all about the orchards, and giving you a glimpse into that spectacular farm on the east side of the Hudson River.
Whoa!
walking through the orchards.
Tip of the glass to Press Then Press, an online cider shop based in Washington State. Bent Ladder Cider and Wine in Doylestown, Ohio. Esoterra Cider Works in Dolores, Colorado. Space Time Mead and Cider Works in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. Taddy Bogle Cider Works in Acme, Pennsylvania. Insider Japan in Japan. Duck Chicken Cider in London, South London. And Ross Cider and Perry Company based in Ross-on-Wye in the West Country of the UK. For helping to support this podcast through the Cider Going Up campaign page at ciderchat.com. They're all patrons of Cider Chat, and you too can become a patron if you find value in this podcast. Please do. Go to the Cider Chat Patreon page, that's spelled Patreon, or hit the donate button at ciderchat.com. And with that, I leave you here. This is Real Wind Caller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Do it like this.
There is a reason why we do it like this.
There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this.
Yeehaw!